10 things you didn't know about samurai. Within samurai mythology, the katana is the preferred weapon for combat. It's hard to picture a samurai without his sword. Some would argue that the sword made the samurai, and while they were indeed used in combat, it turns out that archery was actually considered a more useful skill than that of the sword. And it makes sense when you think about it. Someone firing arrows at you from far away is going to do a lot more damage than someone with a sword at that distance. Sword fighting was considered more of a last resort if the ranged battle had failed. Of course, a samurai would train in many skills, but archery was considered most important. So the question is, why did the swordplay become a samurai's defining weapon? The answer is simple: movies. I mean, let's be honest, sword fights look cool. Now, before you go and grab your katana and head off into the middle of battle, you may want to hear about the other weapon the samurai used. The naginata was a cross between a sword and a gigantic spear, the long shaft and a short sword-like blade at the end. These were the preferred weapons for foot soldiers, since you could attack from further away, not to mention that a katana couldn't reach as far, meaning you had the upper hand. It seems like we're bashing the katana, but it is a seriously good weapon, just not suitable in the middle of a crowded conflict. It may seem strange to think, but as early as the mid-1500s, samurai were using guns, albeit the very early variety of flintlock rifles, which they dubbed Tengashima. The guns weren't that effective for the time, but Japan wanted to be on the cutting edge and ended up producing somewhere around 300,000 of them over the course of a couple of decades. They would start using the guns in all of their conflicts up until the Edo period, where there weren't as many large-scale battles, so they fell out of standard use for a couple of hundred years, but the craft was never forgotten. The Bushido Code, roughly translated, means the way of the warrior, sort of like a moral code for the samurai. You know what we mean. Samurai fight with honor, never attack an unarmed enemy, stuff that really cements them as the good guys. Except those ideals have mostly been twisted and mythologized over the years. The more chivalrous variation of the code is mostly based on modern Western world ideals, with the original code being lost to time. That being said, it's thought that the code was much more militaristic, with the odd noble principle thrown in. The co-localization of the Bushido Code is thought to have happened in the 1800s, when a book was written changing the code to fit more Western ideals. Over the years, the Japanese themselves began to become confused on what the code stood for, considering the original code was rewritten multiple times itself. It was often used as a propaganda tool to better control the samurai behavior, as well as to control their mythos. Credit where credit is due, we're completely confused. As mentioned, the Bushido Code was manipulated to keep control over samurai. The people doing this manipulation were normally those in the position of power. The then government, the current emperor, various feudal systems, they all got their grubby mitts all over the code just to control these brilliant warriors. And what would they have them do? Collect taxes, of course. Samurai would almost always come from high-ranking noble families. They would also most likely hold a position high up in the government. So while not all samurai were tax collectors, there was a vast majority who were. In fact, it's believed that the changing of the Bushido Code to make the samurai seem more heroic was an attempt to make the tax collecting easier, to avoid facing serious resistance from the people. Considering the class-based system Japan had, this theory is quite plausible. Just because the samurai were shanghaied into collecting taxes doesn't mean they enjoyed it. In fact, during the early feudal Japan era, samurai would leave the money problems to their wives. Early samurai felt that money was beneath them and would only handle it if it was part of their duties. While this might seem odd, since we live in a world where women stereotypically spend copious amounts of money, the samurai had their reasoning. They believed that dealing with money was beneath them and that there were more important things to do. Can't really fault them on that. Japan's social class system worked as such. Samurai at the top, followed by those in agriculture, the artisans, and then the merchants. People of noble birth, criminals, or undesirables were considered outside the system. As this system set, samurai quickly realized that despite their class and power, they needed the townsfolk for financial deals, and so the merchant class began to thrive, as the samurai required new equipment and supplies in order to continue surviving. and when they ran out of money, they simply turned to the townspeople, borrowing money and asking for loans. Because of their militaristic style, most of the debts weren't paid back, meaning the people would be less inclined to lend them money, which eventually led the samurai to lead more simple lifestyles, without all the luxuries they had previously enjoyed. To save the samurai from walking about in their underpants, they would wear hakama pants. These types of pants are worn most commonly by kendo students nowadays. While these students wear them out of tradition in today's world, the reason for wearing them in ancient Japan has become an area of debate. Some people believe it was to hide their footwear because, of course, samurai were very self-conscious about their feet. That was sarcasm, by the way. The fact is, these pants were originally designed for maximum comfort for women who spent most of their time on horseback. They were later adopted by men for the same reason. There was also a variation which was more elongated, created for special visits to lords of higher rankings. These were created as a way to discourage assassination attempts since they made the samurai far less mobile, making the lords feel safer. You would think that samurai, being from the land of the rising sun, would be experts in hand-to-hand martial arts, considering the many different variations that exist. Truth be told, while it would be great to imagine a samurai pulling off some Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee-like moves on a group of dudes, the different martial art forms that we know of today were only in the earliest stages of development then. The kind of combat moves used by samurai were based on their movements while in full armor, which limited their range of motion. In fact, hand-to-hand combat was considered to be a last resort, forcing their opponents into a hold where they could then use a small knife, called a tanto, to finish them off. Samurai believed that you'd end up in a hand-to-hand combat situation in only the most desperate of circumstances, so all of their skills were based on preventing them from getting into that situation to begin with. Many people like to imagine that ninjas are the natural enemy of the samurai, sneaking about, hiding in the shadows, throwing their tiny ninja stars at people. They're generally considered to be from the lower class, so you could say that ninjas versus samurai is more of a class war, except it isn't. Technically speaking, the way of the ninja is just another part of samurai warfare. Ninjas were usually from fairly high-class families and trained in specific traits, seeing how ninjas were a specialized warrior style. Ninjutsu itself was less a style of hand-to-hand combat, but more a training program to teach warriors how to be stealthy and covert in general. Ninjas rarely wore all black and usually infiltrated enemy camps, pretending to be one of them for years on end. Fact is, seeing how ninjas were basically a branch on the greater militia tree, many samurai knew many ninja tricks. The two types of warriors are not separate warring factions, but instead part of a stronger, formidable force of awesome.